What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and to learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. I made a commitment late last year that I would change my approach to doing this podcast, that I wouldn't allow myself to get sucked into a predictable weekly routine of pumping out content or scheduling episodes weeks in advance, given just how fluid everything in markets and the political economy have become. This sometimes requires taking a step back from the news cycle to read and reflect on a broader range of material without the pressure of creating content around it. And that's what I've done the last 2 weeks because, truthfully, I don't expect to have this opportunity again anytime soon. My intuition is that we're going to see a lot of things break in this market, and a lot of fireworks take place in the global political economy and on the international stage over the next year. And I spent the last 2 weeks thinking quite a bit about what role I want this podcast to play for all of you during this time. Ultimately, I want this program to help you navigate the turbulence that this period will inevitably bring, not just to your portfolios, but to your lives. And this requires an approach to content creation that doesn't fit easily into the typical format of current affairs podcasts or investor newsletters that most of you are probably familiar with. Going forward, I'm going to try and take a more holistic approach to exploring and analyzing the macro challenges that we are all going to be facing as a community, but which affect each and every one of us as individual human beings. I'm going to continue to bring on the types of guests that you're familiar with to discuss these various weighty and intellectually engaging topics, but I don't want the human element of what will transpire in the world during this period to be lost. And that's the line I'm going to try and walk more deliberately and consciously going forward. And while the subjects may be heavy, I'm excited by the challenge and by the opportunity for personal growth that it will afford me and all of you as well. So this week, I'm sharing with you an appearance that I recently made on the In Bloom podcast with Micaela Richmond, which I think speaks to some of these more human-centered and life-affirming themes, and which I think will play an important part in how we navigate this uncertain future that we are all embarking on, while keeping our souls and our hearts intact. I got pretty emotional during this conversation, which happens to me from time to time whenever I'm asked to talk about the types of things that we discuss today. Conversations like these reveal what I believe is common in all of us, our common humanity, and our capacity to experience joy and suffering as we try and make our lives matter. And that can be really hard, especially when you're younger and you're just starting out, full of insecurities, self-doubt, impatience, fear. I dealt with a lot of fear growing up. Fear of failure, fear of disappointing others, fear of not amounting to anything. That was my greatest fear, that I die and have made nothing of my life. And it wasn't until I overcame those fears of failure and of not amounting to anything, by learning to run into danger, by learning to run into the burning building, that I found my path to bliss. And I say this because I know that millions of you out there feel exactly the same way, even if you haven't found the words to articulate it. My hope is that today's conversation with Micaela can go some way in helping you identify, face, and overcome those fears, regardless of where you are in your life. Because those are the things that stand in the way of joy and love and self-actualization. Those are the things that matter in life, not money or fame or material success. The sooner you recognize that, the sooner you can come into relationship with the mystery of life, from which I believe everything arises and ultimately everything returns. And with that, please enjoy my recent appearance on the In Bloom podcast with the wonderfully curious and passionate Micaela Richmond.
So today I have on Demetri Kofinas, and he's a host of the Hidden Forces podcast. It has 245 episodes. So he's really committed to that. He is a media entrepreneur, media personality. I got his whole life story a while back, and that was amazing to listen to. So hopefully we get a little bit of that in this episode. But welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It's great to be on.
Yeah. Okay. So to start, let's give a little bit of a background. In your opinion, what do you characterize yourself as? Because you've done a lot of things.
Yeah, it's been difficult trying to do that because there's nothing that really kind of works well. I don't work at a particular company where I have a specific title. The term that I use is media entrepreneur. That's like the thing that feels the most accurate because my biggest interests have always been in media, whether it was working on the product development side of media, or whether it was on the technology side as well, or whether it was actually on the content side. It was always media. It was video games, it was radio, it was television, and it's also, I have a theater company, so it's not media, but in a way, theater is kind of old media, pre-media, and then with podcasting.
Did you always love media, or is that something that developed?
I think I always did. I always had a real love for movies. And man, I watched so many movies. It's like this thing, my wife makes fun of me about it because I can remember every line from every movie that was from the 80s and 90s. And I think that's because I was so obsessed. I watched movies over and over again. In the early 90s, when we had moved, because we moved around a lot, we were living at the time in York, Pennsylvania, and we had a little basement in the house. And I kind of turned into my little private, they would call this today a man cave, but it was kind of like my own little little enclave. And I took an old bookshelf that my parents had built by hand, and I turned it into a VHS rack, and I would record. Whenever I'd rent movies, I would record the movies and I'd write them out. I built my own VHS library, and I loved going to the movies. I mean, the movies were one of the best experiences of my life as a kid because it was so exciting. You would, especially when you're a kid, there are not a lot of things that you get to do that feel kind of special. And going to the movies with your dad, which I did sometimes, was one of them. And getting popcorn, waiting in line, hearing people talk about it. Then you get into the theater and you're waiting, and they've got all these trailers to the other movies that you haven't seen that are super exciting. You don't know when they come out. So it was magic for me, Yeah. So I always was.
That sounds literally so magical. That's amazing. I love how you were able to explain that in a way that animated it. And I think that speaks to your love for it. And that's amazing.
Yeah. And I remember when I went to see Back to the Future, the thing that's so interesting about this is because I also have this ability to tell you with high degrees of specificity to the year when certain movies have come out.
Wow.
Yeah. And I don't do this because I remember the date. The way that it feels when I'm doing it is I access the feelings, the smells, the sights, the sounds that are attached to the memory of that movie, of my first experience watching that movie. And by doing that, I'm like, oh, that feels like 1995, or that feels like 1989. And
interesting.
I remember when I first went and saw Back to the Future in 1989, it would have been, unless I'm wrong. And I hadn't seen Back to the Future 1. This was Back to the Future 2. So I just went to see that. I just remember being blown away. And then I started telling people that I was going to get a hoverboard and that I was going to get it for Christmas and all this other stuff. I remember when we went to see Jurassic Park, I think that was 1992, I think. And that was also just this magical experience. Blown away. I was like, how is this? I was confused. I was like, are there dinosaurs somewhere? And they went and they filmed them. And it's like this. And that's the thing I think too, when you're a kid, they say, I don't know enough about this, but I believe there's a theory, and perhaps it's also backed up substantially by evidence, which is that children, when they're born, in their first few years, the world that they experience is similar to what you experience when you're hallucinating or when you're on psychedelics. It's amorphous. They haven't built the cognitive stereotypes to categorize and make sense of the world and build frameworks to take all the stimuli and tell a story about it. And so they're kind of tripping. They're tripping out. And, one way you could think about the process of getting older, it is you are narrowing your field of vision. You're narrowing the stimuli that you take in. You're putting order around all those things. That helps you make sense of the world and navigate it. However, it also at the same time causes you to lose perspective. And I think the challenge in getting older and in being successful and being an innovator, being a creative, is how do you make as much space as possible for the convexity that comes with varied experience, varied perception, while at the same time not getting too caught up in that so that you can't actually formulate a coherent view of the world. It's similar to, you can think of it in a physics sense, moving from gaseous to solid. Where does life occur? Primordial life came together in that primordial stew, in that liquid space. And you have to be able to not be so rigid that you're not open to new ideas, but you also can't be so open to everything that you never get anywhere and you never solidify. So that's how I think about it.
How do you make sure that you continue to do that? Like leave the space, to stay creative and innovative and have that bit of space instead of narrowing too deep? Because I know that a lot of people, I guess, with incoming information tend to narrow so deep that it's hard for them to access the other side of everything and to remain creative and to remain innovative. So how do you do you have any practices? Are you conscious of certain things?
Well, my practice is my podcast, right? It's an interesting question. I also want to recommend for your listeners David Epstein's book, Range, where, I've never read a book that better captures this idea that, and it runs counter to some pre-existing orthodoxy around dedicating yourself to one particular thing to get really good at it, which some areas where this exists, where you've seen this, are like in tennis, this idea that you need to raise the kids from very early age with a racket in their hand. Like I said, just doing the podcast is what makes this possible for me. But, it's a choice that I have made on the podcast to constantly get out of my comfort zone. A great analogy actually of this is from Tim Grover, who was Michael Jordan's strength coach, who had been on my podcast. And Tim talked about how when he would throw chest passes to his players, he would never throw them at their chest. He'd always throw them somewhere else. And the reason is because he never wanted them to get comfortable. The same thing is true with exercise. There was a period in my life where I was in real athletic conditioning, training twice a day for about 2 years. And the way that I approached exercise at that time was to constantly change up never have a routine, really. Have a routine, but the routine itself was constantly changing, always adding in new things, and never feeling bored, always feeling challenged. And that, I don't know enough here about this, but I know the basic facts that your brain is changing constantly when you do that. Your muscles are adapting, and you just become more resilient and stronger and better. So I think that's how I approach learning also.
So I love this idea of generalization versus specialization. I actually had wanted to ask you about that. So it's awesome that you brought it up. Is it just, well, I guess there are definitely different facets, but one of them you said was that generalizing makes you more adaptable. Are there any other things that generalization helps you to do that specialization does not, and vice versa, just to get the full picture of, choosing one or the other?
Yeah, one of the things I said was it adds convexity. And now I want to reference, as you can see now, I love referencing people that I've spoken with. Christopher Cole, who is, he manages a hedge fund called Artemis Capital. And his specialty, and has been for years since I met him over 10 years ago, is volatility. And he had written this great piece a number of years ago, which used Dennis Rodman as a metaphor. Dennis Rodman was the famous power forward for multiple teams in the NBA, famously the Detroit Pistons, but then later the Chicago Bulls, and he was the most prolific rebounder in the league. And the way that Chris used Dennis Rodman in this piece was to say essentially that what you want to do is you want to add convexity to your portfolio in the way that Dennis Rodman added convexity to the Chicago Bulls. And not to get too lost in this metaphor, but what I think happens is when you have a varied diet of information, when you add them to a problem, when you have them to be able to pull from when you're dealing with a complex problem, it allows you the potential to solve that problem in ways that wouldn't have been possible previously. And the returns that you generate, whether financial or personal, whatever they are dramatically better than what you would otherwise get. And I'm trying to think of like a concrete example. I should be referencing David Epstein here. There was one example of one particular tennis player who had started playing basketball at a young age. But that's my answer. I wish I had a good example in mind, but does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's so interesting. And you mentioned volatility. So you are in the finance space as well, and you understand that space very well. How have you seen volatility in finance relate to volatility in life?
Volatility in finance as it relates to volatility in life.
Does it?
Well, what I would say is that volatility is uncertainty. Well, volatility is the expression of uncertainty, right? Because the volatility in price represents uncertainty in outcome. And trying to price uncertainty results in volatility because no one knows. If everyone knows with absolute certainty, you're not going to have any volatility. So that's what I would say it is. And maybe another way to translate that to real life is that, a lot of folks mistakenly have the view when they get into investing or they read a lot of financial writers who unfortunately do this. They have this idea that their job is to get really good at predicting what's going to happen. But that's actually not possible. Financial markets, just like life, are complex, adaptive, nonlinear systems. You can't possibly predict what they're going to do. There's no way. Anyone that tells you that it's not. But you can prepare for a set of uncertain outcomes. And I think that to that extent, if you can approach life with that kind of humility that you have no idea what's going to happen, you don't know if you'll be alive in the next 5 minutes. A lot of the things that you think you're certain about are actually just conditioning based on historical outcomes. I've been alive for the last X number of years, so I'm going to be alive tomorrow. That's not necessarily true. The factors that determine whether you'll be alive tomorrow are not consistent on whether you've been alive up until now. But being prepared for the various set of outcomes, I think, is a crucial transformation in mindset that can make your life much more bountiful and beautiful. And it allows you to manage risk in a way that can be complementary towards your investments as an investor, which should be about risk management, not trying to figure out what's going to happen deterministically and then betting the farm on that.
And that makes a lot of sense because in finance, you don't want to be somebody that's super reactive. Like you want to be able to keep your cool and make sure that you have everything under control and be consistent. So true. I was so fortunate to have a chance to interview and speak with Howard Marks, the famed value investor, on my show for 2 hours a number of years ago. And I was so, to your point, taken by his demeanor and calm. And I just thought about, and that was a question I asked him. I said, to be a great investor, do you need to be calm, for lack of a better word? I don't remember how I'd asked it. And he said, yes, it helps, and of course it helps. And we know this in our personal lives as well. If we're ever dealing with a crisis, the people that are calm are the ones that can manage that situation better. People that are anxious make mistakes. So couldn't agree with you more. That's hugely important, right at the very top. And so is, by the way, when it comes to emotions, ego. And really doing the work to lower that, the impact that ego has. Because having a chip on your shoulder really helps in your life. In some ways, it's like a double-edged sword. Again, to make another quote, I didn't have a chance to interview Phil Jackson or Kobe Bryant, but Phil talked about how Kobe's greatest assets were also his greatest vices or risks. That is true for all of us. And so when you have a chip on your shoulder, it motivates you to work harder. But if you don't do the work to deal with the demons that come out of that, it can destroy you. And ego can destroy you, so you have to work on that too. You mentioned a chip on your shoulder. Did you feel like you had a chip on your shoulder for a long time?
Of course. I'm sure do. The chips have gotten much smaller, but totally. Yeah, 100%. Growing up, I was short for my age growing up and up until kind of I hit puberty. And we always moved around a lot and we're from an immigrant family. So I always felt like an outsider. I always felt like I had something to prove. And that motivated me to be physically tough. By the way, there were costs associated with that. I became unnecessarily standoffish, closed, emotionally closed, guarded, dickish. And I picked a lot of fights. I spent a lot of time learning how to fight as a kid. I wrestled in high school. I did mixed martial arts in college and after college and through my 20s. And that was a great experience. And that's something that I value. But it also came with costs of, like I said, being closed off, and not just in my relationship with people in the daily world, but also in my romantic life and in other areas. And I had to do the work over many years to overcome those things. And that's just one of my chips. That's not all of them. So, but it's made me who I am. Like I said, there's so much great that came out of that, but then there are bad things that I've had to work on that didn't serve me and that set me back in my 20s. And in early 30s too, a lot. I think most of the progress I've made, the definitive progress I've made has been in the last few years.
Why? Why this last few years specifically?
Well, you know this because I spoke to you and some of your classmates, but I had a brain tumor diagnosis that I had when I was 28 years old, and I ended up with a brain surgery at the age of 32, which kind of sidelined me from my trajectory in my career, for lack of a better word, which it's not really a career, but I'd sort of gotten on a certain track that I'd created, and I felt like I had a direction. And so I had to kind of reboot, and it was really hard, and there was a lot of uncertainty, and I struggled with that, and I struggled with not feeling successful, struggled with feeling like a failure. And when I started Hidden Forces in early 2017, that was the first time in years since my brain surgery that I'd finally felt like I had realigned with that deeper sense of purpose and mission that animated my life and that gave me a sense of meaning. And that's so important to me. And that I think is important to anyone, whether they recognize it or not. And it took a number of years doing that to overcome the insecurities of having been on the outside looking in. You know, being on Calypso's island, looking out towards Ithaca, wanted to come home. And it hasn't been until the last few years where I felt that way, where I felt like I had accomplished certain things again in my career and in my work, where I could also focus on my personal life, which had been sort of this plant that had not been attended to, had not been watered. Because again, so much of my life was about being tough, being strong, you know, not let anybody push me around, and really just prioritizing that at every step and neglecting the softer, gentler, more feminine, more open parts of myself, the receiving parts of myself.
It's really interesting that you mentioned that, because I completely understand. I think that there's something about the way that we've gone about the world. Maybe it had to do with the way that media was introduced to us, but fear pollutes the world. Like, there's so much fear, there's so much scarcity, there's so much idea of like, oh, I'm going to cross the street, or I'm going to go to a new city or a new place, and it's just ridden with bad things. And I know that I dealt with that too. And it's really, really interesting to try and open yourself up after getting to a place where it's comfortable to actually not be open.
Yeah. Well, we talked about this early on, right? With respect to a child when it's born, and the world doesn't make any sense at all, and it spends its early years and later life trying to make sense of it and putting it together and constraining it. And that's the challenge, right? As you get older, then you've done all that work that you needed to do to make sense of the world. But now, if you want to make progress, you've got to undo some of that. It's the same thing with the things that we do to compensate for those fears and to address those fears when we're young. Those things don't serve us when we're adults, you know, and you see this with people, you know, let's say people that grow up in an abusive home, they adjust their behaviors to protect themselves as children because they don't have control. But those things don't serve them when they're successful multimillionaire adults. And you see this all the time with very successful people. They get to where they are because of the things, the adversity that they had to deal with as children. But those behaviors, compensatory behaviors that they developed, those adaptive behaviors that they developed to manage the adversity, can be their undoing as adults. So the challenges never end. You've always got to put in that work to grow, and in this particular example, to open up in your later years.
I fully understand. And it resonates so deeply because that's kind of how it's been for me. Like it's strange to go through that process of recognizing that the things that used to help you don't help you anymore, and that it's okay to let them go. And it's difficult. I wonder, so the way that I do it is I'm just like super observant, and I've just become very observant over the things that happen. And if I see myself react in a way that I know I shouldn't have, then I'll kind of audit the why behind that. How have you found is helpful to go about that?
Well, I always do that, or I try to always check myself. It's imperfect. And I think a great example is like if I'm underslept, I'm more likely to make mistakes. I'm more likely, for example, to pop off on Twitter and say something that is motivated by a need to get attention, or, well, in this case, if I haven't slept, it's because I'm just pissed and I just want to tweet something because I'm pissed and I want to vent. Or I might yell at somebody. I don't actually do this. In the past, I would have done it. But let's say I might yell at somebody for cutting me off in traffic or something. Or let's say you're feeling insecure for some reason. You do things in order to satisfy that insecurity, to make you feel less insecure. I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which you have to just acknowledge that you're going to be imperfect, but to the extent that you can, to always ask yourself, like, why am I doing this? What do I want to call this person right now? Why do I want to tweet this? And I think that is about protocols. It's that simple. And I think that that's a lifelong process of learning the value of protocols, of systematizing behavior, checklists. You know, there's a reason why doctors are told that they need to do all these things before administering care. It isn't because they couldn't do it a different way and still administer the care just as well, but it's there because what if you made a mistake? What if you missed something? I do the same thing when I'm preparing for my interviews. I have a checklist to go through. I don't necessarily need the checklist, but it prevents me from making a mistake if I'm tired, if I'm this, if I'm that. So I think just having that kind of regimented self-reflection and holding yourself accountable on a regular basis, like literally every day, will help reduce the number of errors so that you don't accumulate a series of unforced errors and get to a place where you're far from where you want to be in your life.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love exactly how you said that. It was really, really well phrased. I had never thought about creating a checklist. I think that that's really interesting, just to have like a physical reminder or something right there in front of you all the time. I think that's a great idea. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about was how interviewing all of these different people has changed your perception of truth. Like, I think the thing that has been interesting for me is the more people that I interview, the less apparent objective truth becomes, or the more, I guess, the easier it is to understand different people's perspectives. Like the idea that my understanding of the world is true, period, and there's no way that anybody should, think differently. Otherwise, they're dumb or whatever. It's done me a really great service to hear people and to really, really understand their philosophies and the things behind it, because truly the people that think differently than I do see and interact in an entirely different world than I do. Like, it's so insane. But you've interviewed like 245 people, more over your career. how have you learned to decipher truth and really understand that whole space of like differing perspectives?
That's a great question. Part of it's just heuristics that you develop over time. It's the same way that like detectives who are, a 60-year-old detective or 50-year-old detective or whatever will tell you that he or she can just walk into a room and they just know something's not right. They don't know why. It's the same principle that works in artificial intelligence. Machine learning algorithms can't tell you necessarily why they know something. We don't know, for example, why Barack Obama's picture with Michelle Obama and their two kids in black and white from 2008 when they won the election performed so well in A/B testing against even color photos and any other kind of photo of any kind of variety, but it just did. And so over time, cumulative experience, the taking in of data through the course of one's life, you develop certain heuristics for parsing truth and fiction. And you can use those when talking with people. And you may not know why this person's bullshitting you, but you're pretty sure they're bullshitting you. So, I mean, that's a skill that I've developed that I can't articulate in a coherent theory. But then there's just kind of just all the knowledge that I've developed over the course of my life. And because I've done so much work to expose myself to so many different fields and professions, I'm able to cross-reference a lot of information during the course of a 2-hour-long conversation. And I can tell whether or not someone is correct or not, or knows what they're talking about, generally speaking, or not. So, yeah, I don't know if that's the answer to your question, if that's what you were getting at, or if you were talking more in terms of in a larger sort of philosophical sense of truth and the ontological discernibility of reality.
So I like the point you brought up. Understanding when people are messing with you is very interesting. Like the whole heuristics thing. Do they even believe what they're saying? Are there different things behind that? That's really interesting to me. I was asking the question along the philosophical lens as well, because I think that it's more difficult to tell what is true whenever people don't know that they believe something that is false, and either they're missing some sort of information or they're interpreting something incorrectly, some correct information incorrectly. And I think that that's interesting to me. Like, it's possible that there are unlimited amounts of, philosophies that people could take that could actually work for them. Mm-hmm. But I'm always in discovery of whether or not there's a best. Like, is there something that serves us best? You don't think so?
Well, okay. So first of all, just at a high level, again, to bring it back. And by the way, I do think that my sense is that there is a universal theory of reality, but mm-hmm. I'll never know what that is. I don't think anyone will. But one of the ways in which I've come to this feeling is because so oftentimes in the deep recesses of my cognitive mind, I feel that there is a universality to all these different things that I believe. Now, what that may actually reflect is the functioning of my brain. And really that's because everything is in this apparatus, and there's something about that. But, we talked about how children, go from this completely amorphous view of reality to one that's highly constrained and managed. And the same thing is, I think, true around objective reality and truth. So I don't believe that there is any way to know if there is an objective reality. Mm-hmm. And I think what we do in the world is we actually come to a consensus reality around truth. Because reality this is now, one way to think about reality is that it's a collective shared illusion of the truth, of reality, of the world, that we all have to more or less agree on in order to operate by certain rules. And those are the rules we agreed to, and so that's how we, go about living our lives. That doesn't mean that there isn't something like gravity that's pulling us down, but that even what we think gravity isn't necessarily that. That there are, in other words, objective forces, but our ability to understand them objectively isn't something that I think we can claim with certainty. And so, to going back to like frameworks, unfortunately, science is one of those words that's been deeply degraded by popular
Mm-hmm.
culture. But science is what it really is the most valuable operational framework that we've ever devised, because it empowers human beings to make sense of the world in a way that is empirically superior to any other framework. Now, it's not sufficient for providing meaning and for satisfying the psycho spiritual emotional needs of a human life,
Mm-hmm.
but simply in terms of the power process of exercising power in the world, science is your best friend. And so I think that rigorously testing your hypotheses, trying to constantly falsify them, constantly holding yourself and others accountable, and I think that really requires a kind of equivalent spiritual meditative daily practice. I really do. I mean, that goes back to what one of your early questions was. This isn't something that you just say, okay, I'm going to just be scientific. No, because you're constantly fighting the entropy of behavioral cognitive
Interesting.
bias
Mm-hmm.
every single day. So it has to be a spiritual practice of this kind of thing of like, my guide is the truth. I want to know the truth. And I'm humble enough to know that I'll never really know it. So within the constraints of these parameters, of these variables,
Mm.
what is that truth, the truthiness of the world?
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I try and approach my life.
How do you come to the conclusion that, okay, this is truth? Because so your podcast is called Hidden Forces, and as you just kind of explained, without naming it, like there are so many things that happen to us that we are not accountable for. That there are ways that we have been influenced. There are things that have shaped our minds. There are ways that we have experienced the world that we aren't even entirely aware of. And those are the things that have shaped us and shaped our understanding of truth. Is it like a, framework or principle or sort of approach that you take to this? Or how do you go about that?
One area where this is really, it's worked well has been in my personal relationships, all of my personal relationships, and most prominently the relationship with my wife, where we have arguments like every couple, but I really do approach every single argument with what I feel like now has just become an ingrained humility around my ability to really intuit her perception.
Mm.
And I think, a lot of people, they do what I think is called, actually, this is probably not, because I think mind mapping is actually a good thing, probably. Whatever that exact definition is, I think it's actually used in a good way. But what a lot of people do is they think that they know what the other person is thinking and feeling.
Mm.
And rather than constantly trying to update what they think that the person is feeling based on what they're telling them, and also always knowing that they might be wrong. So I can't quite remember what your question was, but if it was this, my answer is I'm just always humble about, I don't actually remember. Now I think I lost the thread of your question. I was
Well,
doing
okay, so
so
I love where
well
you're going
not
with this.
doing this. I suffer from attention deficit disorder, so I work really hard actually to pay attention. So say again.
Okay, well, first, I would love to say that I loved where you were going with that. I love the idea of humility. I think that that is underrated.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Uh,
Totally. And I'll just say this really quick. Certain people, and maybe women more than men in this, suffer from too much humility or
mm,
too much sort of or lack of confidence around what they know and what they don't know. So then you also run the risk of in the opposite direction of being too gaseous, to the point about the physical, gaseous to solid, being too open and not really drawing the line somewhere. And that's why
mm,
this is there's no rubric for this. You have to feel your way through, and you have to become comfortable with the fact that you're going to make mistakes. It's inevitable. You're going to be too
mhm.
open. You're going to be too closed. Sometimes you just got to make a decision, but maybe that decision ends up being wrong, but you had to
Mm-hmm.
make one, you know?
Love that. I love that so much. So my question before was about your frameworks, like whenever it comes to hidden forces and the things that influence us, like you almost have to step away from yourself and then approach information. And I don't even know if that's possible, but how do you go about approaching information and approaching different people with differing opinions and even people with similar opinions and perspectives? How do you go about approaching people and deciphering truth? Because you said that truth is your like North Star. What is true?
Yeah.
So how do you do that?
Yeah, I think it is my North Star. I mean, there are a few North Star. I mean, truth and honesty and integrity. First of all, when you're speaking with all sorts of different people, again, to the point about protocols, you have a protocol, which is one, it includes a number of things. One is expose myself to a variety of ideas and people. Why? Back to the point about convexity and adding Dennis Rodman to your portfolio. That exposure opens you up to things that you simply can't deliberately do. You can't go out and devise that. It's serendipity. And so when you're exposing yourself to people with different ideas, there are two ways in which that can lead to an outcome. One is you could be an asshole, like a lot of the people that are currently on television. And what they do is they'll bring on someone who has a different point of view. It's usually actually not in good faith. Actually, it's almost never in good faith. It's someone who isn't not an articulative person, doesn't properly articulate that view. And then you just shit on that person. You make them look like an asshole for 5 minutes. You yell at them, you berate them, and then you get them off the air. That's one way in which you can use alternative views. But if you have a good faith approach and you couple that with variety of experience, that's almost all you need. Then the natural, iterative, adaptive, evolutionary process of learning takes hold. And you just learn. That's it. So good faith and convexative experience, serendipity, exposing yourself, doing things that make you feel uncomfortable. I was in Costa Rica a week ago, and the first two activities that we did were ones that I was very much looking forward to and had no anxiety around or fear around, which was horseback riding. We went through the jungle. We went on the beach. And another one was ATVs. We rented an ATV, and man, that was the most fun I had. Like that was by far the best. And the third activity was one that I thought that I was nervous to do, but I thought I would enjoy, which was zip lining. And I ended up not really enjoying it because it actually wasn't as fun as I thought it would be. But it was nerve-wracking the first time because I think the first one was over 1 kilometer long, and you're ziplining through like a ravine. But it wasn't as scary as I thought it would be. In any case, I hope now, again, I think this is the second time I think I forgot kind of where this question originated, but I think that what I was trying to get to was that I constantly try and put myself in uncomfortable situations. And that's very hard when you're starting that process earlier in your life, whenever it is, you decide to do it. But once you become conditioned to exposing yourself to discomfort, you become comfortable in discomfort. And if you stop doing that, no matter how long you were doing it, no matter what age you're at, it's going to be harder to start it up again. It's going to be easier than it was when you first started.
Yes.
But this is true. I'll give you another example. I used to be on television all the time. And when I was no longer on TV, or even if a few months had passed and I hadn't given a television interview, there was a little bit of nervousness around getting on TV. But never was it as scary as it was the first time I was ever on television. So I think you do yourself a great service by literally, as much as you can, putting yourself in uncomfortable situations.
This is so funny that you say this because I was actually thinking about this morning. Probably 2 months ago, I was very, very good about being consciously uncomfortable and raising. I always think about it as raising my standard, like raising my bar. What becomes normal to me, and honestly, it does not take that long to fall below that. And then to make it much more difficult, something that used to be normal, that used to be, effort enough, but didn't feel taxing. Like whenever I thought about it, it wasn't like, oh man, has become that way. And so it's interesting because it's that whole process of, honestly, there are so many working out metaphors, but they just work so well, of like training that muscle and of getting to that place where you're strong enough to do another, pull up, or you're strong enough to do another. And yeah, I thought that was so amazing that you said that, because I know exactly what that's like. And I need to get back on that. And it's just this conscious thing.
Get back on that in physical exercise?
Get back on that in, it's not physical. Like if it were physical, I think it would be easier. But the fact that it's not physical actually makes it more difficult for me. And I don't know if that's a common thread among other people, but that's an interesting thing for me, because I think that I can tell myself like, oh, that's not me, or you can give yourself excuses about who you are much more easily whenever it's something non-physical.
Yeah. I think it probably depends. I mean, there are probably people out there for whom physical exercise and motivation is the hardest thing in the world.
Mm-hmm.
I totally understand where you're coming from. And I think this is actually one of the most important conversations that people can have in the course of their life, to understand this. Because we talked about fear earlier on in the conversation. Surrendering to fear is betrayal. It's betrayal of self. And one of the scariest things in the world is a person who has betrayed him or herself. And there are a lot of people, unfortunately, who live their lives constantly betraying themselves. It's heartbreaking to see, to know, because you can't save that person. They have to save themselves. And again, one of the easiest ways to avoid that, because we all experience fear, we all experience comfort and seek comfort, but you have to just make it a mindset, make it a daily practice to constantly look for the things that scare you and to assess why they scare you and to decide whether that fear is rational or irrational. In other words, whether that fear conveys danger that needs to be respected, or whether that fear reflects anxiety about stepping into your truth, stepping into your life. Because again, I think this is something we talked about when I was speaking to you and your classmates, which is that we have a very basic, primitive part of our brain that through which we experience fear, and that evolved for good reason. But the vast majority of circumstances in which we experience that visceral fear in the course of a human life are not actually appropriate. It's a carryover. So like if you feel the kind of fear that you would feel in the jungle if you were staring at a lion, when you're staring at a girl, that means you should go talk to her. You really should go talk to her. And you might make an asshole out of yourself. You actually will make a bigger asshole out of yourself if you don't, and if you try to be somebody you're not. But even if it doesn't work the first time, the second time it'll work better. And eventually you're going to be so good at talking to girls that I'm using girls now, but it could be any example. It could be boys. It could be someone who you idolize and you want them to like you. You want them to notice you. Any of those types of situations, and any other situation in which you feel fear, you're going to get so good at it that you won't even recognize yourself. And it's beautiful when that happens. It really is.
It's like, I see it in my mind as like a metamorphosis. It's like you've almost stepped into something new.
You're in this life to grow. I wanted to say to grow. I'm torn between saying to grow as a person or to grow as a spiritual being. And I hesitate to use the word spiritual because I don't like the word, but the word captures the mystery of experience of life that can't be quantified, that can't be articulated in a scientific theory, that can't be answered by science. There's something much deeper about lived experience in a human life. I think a lot of people, they're not really in touch with, and they're not engaged with, not for any fault of their own, but because in many ways there's been a spiritual death in our society. Like we don't really do a good job of giving people maybe a framework is the best word I can think of. Just like we give people frameworks for thinking about what is good behavior, what is bad behavior, how to be financially successful, how not to be. We don't really have a way to do that. Religion, Christianity in Western society was that for many years, but there's been a deterioration of Christianity over many years for good reason, having to do with many of the people who practiced Christianity and all the sins that were and have been conducted by, quote, Christians. And this isn't just Christians, this is across the board, all these different religions. But again, that goes to your question, is there one universal truth? There's no universal truth. There's no one way. It's a constant adaptive process. Again, life is a mystery. But the privilege of living a human life is having that opportunity to walk into danger, to live a courageous life, to be courageous. There's merit and virtue in courage and living courageously and stepping into love and not letting fear be the decider for where your life takes you, you know? I'll say one more thing. It's the path to getting to what I'm about to say now isn't direct, but it feels right. In 2015, I helped produce an event at the New Yorker Hotel. It was a very large conference of people in the, for lack of a better word, death and dying space. People interested in death, people that worked in death, hospice workers, etc. And the opening talk was given by 3 researchers at NYU who were part of the psilocybin cancer trials. They were in phase 2 trials. They just released their phase 2 results at our event for the first time. And before the event, I sat in on a series of private interviews that they had conducted with patients who had cancer, terminal illness. I think they were all terminal cancer patients. And it was just wild to watch these interviews. You know, Michael Pollan subsequently wrote about this. He talked about one patient in particular who was smiling under his oxygen mask while he was dying. And there was a woman, I remember her speaking about this, and she said that what doing the psilocybin and the psychotherapy in line with the psilocybin did for her was that it took away her fear. She died. I believe she died. By the time I had seen the interview, she was already dead. And she cried when she said that. And I totally related with that, having been through something myself, which I've talked about, my brain tumor. That fear is such a burden to carry around in your life. It's such a burden, and it weighs you down. It weighs so many people down. You know, if you could just get rid of that. And if society didn't have to carry that around, because it takes love and fear they're the yin and the yang. You know, when you have love, there's no place for fear. There's to quote a movie, the adaptation by Charlie Kaufman, in which an underrated actor who's, there's Nicolas Cage, who has had some just wonderful performances in his career. He's a crazy guy. But in this movie, he played 2 twin brothers. And towards the end of the movie, he had a conversation with himself. And he admitted one brother had a conversation. But I think that ultimately they were supposed to be really the same people. But he told his brother about how he had noticed that he knew of an instance where there was this girl that he really loved, and then he, was just fawning over her. And then when they left, she was making fun of him. And the brother said he never told him because he didn't want to break his heart. And his brother said, "No, I knew about that. I'd heard her." He goes, "Oh, you did?" He goes, "Yeah, but it didn't matter. Like, my love for her was not something that she could take away. That was my love." And, I think that's the truth. I think learning to live your life, I think this is a quote I also gave you guys in that lecture, in that conversation, which was that a book that was influential for me after my diagnosis was Dan Millman's The Peaceful Warrior, Way of the Peaceful Warrior. And there's a quote in that book that says that a peaceful warrior's sword is made of love. Where it cuts, it gives life, not death. And we could all use more love in our lives. We could all learn to live with that sort of love. That's how I feel.
I feel like I need to give that a moment.
I told this quote, I think this one or another one I may have mentioned in that conversation I had with you guys. And I told you, I try really hard not to get emotional when I talk about this, and I think I tap into, and I think all of us, I think there's certain things that tap us into a truth, because I think there is truth.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you can prove it empirically. I don't think you can know it rationally, but I think you can feel your way through. And that's a way of speaking to what I was trying to get at, which is that you have to feel your way through life. You can't have the answers. I had this wonderful conversation with Jerry Colona, who wrote a book about this kind of stuff that pulled a lot from a lot of these different sages. And there was a lot of Joseph Campbell in there. And I love Joseph Campbell. And I love mythology because it gives you that non-empirical, non-rational, feel your way through life templates of mythology. And we were talking, and in his book, he had written that we all want to know the road is windy, but we all want to know which way leads to bliss. We all want to know that, especially when we're younger. We want to know, we want this person to love us. We want to be successful. We want to just get there. We're so impatient. Even if we know that the road is windy and that it takes a while, and yet we still want to know which way leads to bliss. And that's suffering right there, that chasm between the road is windy and wanting a narrow path to bliss. It leads to suffering. And the more that you can accept the uncertainty of life as you get older, that this is the nature of the journey, that it is the journey to Ithaca, that that is what life is. And the more you can embrace that, the happier you will be, the less suffering you will have.
Man, I'm like, I need to re-listen to this. So I love Joseph Campbell so much. I think whenever you were talking about Joseph Campbell and the myths, I think, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I think I understand what you mean by that there's no objective truth. Do you mean that truth lies in a myth? Like there's something that's underlying that is so true that we put different names to it, and there are different ways to explain it. Like we have so many different heroes' journeys, but it still hits the same way because that is truth.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay. I love that. I fully agree.
That's what poetry is, by the way. Poetry uses lies to convey truth.
Interesting. I had never heard of that.
Well, it says things that are empirically false, that are irrational, but which convey truth, which speak to us on a deep level, because they're not meant to be taken literally, which is the big problem that I have with atheists and sort of dogmatic materialist atheists, so to speak. And this is, I want your listeners to understand, when I use the term atheism, I don't mean people that don't believe in a Christian God or any particular type of religion. I mean people that believe that life can be sufficiently explained through material sciences. And I don't remember where I was going with that, but it may have just been that, oh, yes, now I remember. I was making the point about, like people that read the Bible and criticize it and say, give me a fucking break. Mm-hmm. All this shit is bullshit. Well, of course that shit is not meant to be taken literally. It's metaphor. It's metaphor. And it isn't just about the wisdom of teachings in the Bible or in Greek mythology or in Eastern religions, it's also about the spiritual practice, the sacred, ritual. There's something about ritual that brings people together and that opens the spiritual gateways. And, you can't grab truth. You can't grab a hold of the essence of life or the essence of truth or the nature of reality. You just kind of get close to it. And the closer you get, you can feel it. You can feel it in your heart. And that's another thing that's really interesting, which is that in the world today, so many of us are in our heads. We're disembodied. I think this is actually, now I'm really reaching in terms of not having studied this subject much, but having just kind of been interested in trying to understand it, which is the drop-off in sex and intimacy over the years. Apparently, younger generations today have less sex or less interested in sex.
This is interesting to me as well.
And I wonder if not part of this has to do with a sense of disembodiment that comes from the amount of digital intermediation of experience and the amount of the world that you experience through the simulation of your mind, as opposed to the more visceral experience of being in the physical world that cuts you off from the vital parts of your life. And so, yeah, you can just take it from there.
That is an interesting topic to me as well, because that's my generation. Like, I've seen it happen where I grew up in this space where it was wrong to think and to talk and to just anything along those lines. Like, I mean, culturally, it was slightly puritanical.
You mean culturally, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that that's actually done us a disservice. And I guess to hit the home run, like, it's interesting how there are so many different aspects of things. It's not just cause and effect. It's like cause thousands of effects. And it's so difficult to make those choices and to understand that the choices that you make have consequences, and not only one consequence, but many consequences. And there have been so many things throughout history that we've done thinking that it was for the good or for the right, like, but it's hard for us to understand how the choices that we make for other people influence other people.
I mean, totally. Our parents who make all the choices for us growing up, all the choices that are consequential, have a huge role in shaping us. And some of us more than others. And a big part of getting older is learning to unlearn many of the things that your parents taught you, usually implicitly, by virtue of the example they set or the things that they just subconsciously validated or invalidated in your behavior. So yeah, no, I totally agree with that.
Okay. I want to be very, reticent of your time. So I have some final rapid fire questions, and they're kind of deep, but just give your first instinct, something that really, really feels correct as the answer. Ready?
Sure.
What do you value in life?
Okay. So just to be clear, you want me to just give the immediate answer that comes to my mind and not...
Yeah, something that just feels
very... Love was the first one that came to mind.
And what does that mean to you?
Love is the most uninhibited way of being. It feels like falling, where there's no effort. My grandfather used to say, I have two grandfathers, like everyone. One of them passed away when I was so young that I only have one faint memory of him. But I was told that he would say that it takes effort to hate somebody. That's true. And love, for me, is the most effortless mode of existence. And I think in some ways, getting older, we should do things to move more towards love, just like we're moving towards the source. We're moving towards the end of our lives. And so that's what it means to me.
I love that. What is a good life?
a life lived virtuously. And by virtuously, virtue includes a number of values, one of which is, I can't remember what all the cardinal virtues are, but one of them, I'll use my own list. I think living virtuously means living with honesty and integrity and good faith and courageously confronting your fears, not betraying yourself. Not betraying yourself.
Mm.
Yeah, that's how I would answer that question.
I love that. Not betraying yourself. I definitely want to write on that. I think that's big. Like we know what is good for ourselves deep down. I love that. Okay. What lights your spirit up?
Laughing. I mean, I'm constantly, people that know me know that I'm almost always joking. And I mean, one of the things I love doing in this new world that we live in today, because we can send these voice memos, I just send, whenever I feel like I just send funny voice memos to people. And I'm constantly laughing. And that's something that I started to do. I mean, I was always a prankster, always funny, always joking. Always. But I was always burdened too as a child. And that burden was with me. Like I said, I mean, it hasn't been until the last few years. I feel like around 2018 was when I started to laugh a lot. And I've just been laughing ever since.
Wow. I love laughing. Laughing is amazing. It's like, I don't know. There's always I think it changes the way that you interact with the world.
Well, the Greek tragedians had this dichotomy between the Apollonian, what Nietzsche called the Apollonian, and the Dionysian, the tragedy and comedy. Shakespeare obviously used this as a framing for his plays.
Mm-hmm.
And both tragedy and comedy are frameworks for looking at the same objective reality. If we want to use this template, what is the difference between a Shakespearean tragedy and a Shakespearean comedy? One ends in a wedding, one ends in a funeral, but they're largely the same thing. And so you can view events in a tragic way, or you can view them in a comedic way. That doesn't mean that you don't lose people that you love. And I'm not suggesting that you should laugh when something like that happens. And it's more complicated than that, but and I really don't want to try and define this too tightly, but I would say that I think that as you get older, the objective should be to try and find the love in things and the humor in life. Because I think when you're younger, it's much easier for life to take life and things much more seriously. And again, that doesn't, and I think and this is really important. I don't mean to suggest that life shouldn't be serious. I actually think an important part of life absolutely should be serious. Life is in some ways a serious thing in the sense that you have a serious responsibility. And I think you should live your life with that sense of responsibility, that this is a privilege, that you've been given something, that this can't just be pissed away. And to the point about betrayal, that's what betrayal is. You're throwing it away. You're not valuing it. You have this in your hand and you break it, this gentle, beautiful thing that is life, and you don't, without understanding it. And so that kind of meandered a bit in the answer, but that's the totality of that response kind of was my best attempt at answering your question or telling you what I think in response to your word.
That was beautiful. Thank you. And the last question that I have for you is, if you could only leave one piece of advice for the world and the people that come after you, after us, just generations below, what would that piece of advice be?
don't let anyone take away your humanity. I think there's a lot of that going on. I think that's going to be a challenge for people, for our future generations. And that speaks to the mystery, it speaks to the heart. It speaks to the sense of disembodiment. You're so beautiful, each and every one of you. And there are a lot of people in the world who betrayed themselves, and many of these people have incredible power. Maybe most of the people who have immense power in the world are dark figures who've betrayed themselves long ago and who are Darth Vaders. And they seek to possess that which cannot be possessed. And, you know, there are a lot of people who have spent their life behind bars who have found peace in this way, you know, who understand that people can take your life in the final act, but they cannot take your soul. They cannot take your humanity. You own that. You really do. You do have choice. And I think there's so much darkness in the world we live in today, and there's so much confusion, and there's so many attempts to create this hive-minded, like human animal. And it's tough engaging in all of that because there's no simple answer. There's truth to things that we learn about free will, about, you know, the power of psychology and the power of luck and distributions of outcome. But deep down, there is this attempt to, I think, tell us that I don't want to try to qualify it, but I guess what I want to just say is that there's something deep in there. There's a mystery in there that you can't let anyone take that from you, because there's the truth and you should protect it. And that's what I mean when I talk about don't let them take away your humanity.
Wow. That was amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, for sharing everything. You have so much knowledge in you and so much lived experience, and with your podcast and with all of your media stuff, you have been able to take on the experiences of others. So you have even more experience. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing that.
Thank you. You're such a great interviewer. You've really done a wonderful job. You impressed me in the questions that you asked when I spoke to you and your classmates as well. So I look forward to seeing what you're going to do with your life.
Thank you so much.
For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to full episodes, transcripts, and intelligence reports, which include additional notes, resources, links, and other material that will help you get the most out of each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website at hiddenforces.io. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.